George Khalaf, Data Orbital. We are at the end of the campaign. So we've been visiting with you throughout the campaign season. We've talked a lot about early voting. Yes. When we talked about this with you before, you had Republicans with an early ballot lead anywhere from 10 to 12 points. That's narrowed considerably. What do we know today about the way early voting went?
Numbers hot off the press from this morning. We have the Republican ballot advantage at 7.7% statewide with 1,540,000 ballots. And why that number is critical is we are about 10,000 ballots away from having more early voters vote in 2018 than voters that voted in all of the 2014 midterm elections. Wow. So turnout is absolutely through the roof. And as of this morning, the 7.7 Republican ballot advantage is 1.3% higher than same time and where we ended up actually in the presidential in 2016.
Okay, so that ballot advantage, similar to the presidential in 2016, what about voter turnout generally compared to typical midterm versus the last presidential?
So definitely higher than a typical midterm. I mean, absolutely blowing it out of the water. And even from a presidential perspective, we have more ballots in today, close to 100,000 more ballots in today than comparative to the last midterm, to the last presidential in 2016. So even turnout comparative to presidential elections, it's pretty dang high. Now the big question mark is in a presidential election, there's a lot of day of activity. And so now the thing to watch is what happens day of in terms of turnout.
Okay, let's talk about those day of voters, election day voters. Did some of them already vote as early voters, or should we expect typical election day turnouts?
Yeah, and that's the big thing too. There's been a lot of hyperbole around the shift in the numbers. I mean, this last week and a half, if you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're even alive and have a pulse looking at the news. One side thinks, oh, this is, business as usual. Other side thinks like, oh my God, sky's falling for the other side. This is good for me. Here are some sort of absolute truths that we can talk about from a numbers perspective. Both Republicans and Democrats have 16.5% of their total ballots. The ones that have voted as of today, 16.5% of them have voted in at least one out of the last 3 general elections day of. Okay. And so neither side is really what we call in politics cannibalizing their day of voters. It's fairly equal. And that was something that folks are kind of positing online is that, well, Republicans are just having a lot of their day of voters, which is why they were ahead at first, or now Democrats are catching up. That's not the case. It is very equal. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. 16.5%, which actually does not seem that high, and that number really drops when you don't include 2012 general election. That Obama year, where turnout was very high in Arizona and across the country, a lot of those voters voted in that election specifically.
You put out an analysis of some takeaways from early ballots, and you mentioned that the Republicans had opened up that big lead early, but you said Democrat voters were hanging on to their ballots longer. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so obviously they hung on to their ballots longer, and now in the last couple days, I'd say 4 to 5 to be specific, voters are younger, they're more female, they've been more Democratic. But again, a lot of those populations had been sort of underrepresented. I mean, for the first week and a half in totality, there were more men than women overall that had voted. We know that was never going to be the case. We've said since day one, we expect about 53% of the electorate to be female. We are on our way to meet that. We also expect the electorate to be about 10% 18 to 35-year-olds. We're on our way to meet that. There's also been some talk about, Hispanic turnout. Hispanic turnout as a total ballots is much higher than 2014. But so is all turnout. So when it's all said and done, Hispanics actually are identical as a percentage of total ballots. They're about 10.8% of ballots today comparative to the midterm in 2014, and they're under the presidential. So a lot of the things that I think we expected to happen that we weren't seeing in the first week and a half are now beginning to happen, which is what's causing the shift in the numbers. It's just the way that people are obviously conveniently interpreting those shifts that would benefit them more than obviously it benefits the other side. But a lot of this stuff is what we expected to take place.
One of the things you're hearing from politicos to the left of the spectrum is, well, George, it's trending with more female voters. It's trending with younger voters. That's good for Democrat candidates. Are you not quite convinced of that yet?
I mean, of course it's good for Democrat candidates, but the end result is what's more important than where the trend is, right? Because if you started with many more males and now all of a sudden it is a lot more females, but it ends up where you'd expect it to be with 53% women, that's usual. Is the population going to be maybe a tiny bit younger? Sure. But it's not going to be an earth-shattering increase like we are even seeing in other states. From an Hispanic population, like I said, it's going to be fairly equal. Will Democrats have a slightly higher percent maybe than they had in the presidential? Yes, they have 0.3% more share of ballots today as compared to the presidential, but Republicans have 1.4% more. Are there more Democratic voters than what were expected in a midterm? Yes. But this year was, quite frankly, never going to look like a midterm. It was going to look like a presidential. It just is what it is. From turnout, it's looked like that from day one. The tone in the country has looked more like a presidential. That's what's panning out, except Republicans are slightly doing better than a presidential, and Democrats are at about where you'd expect. So when you're comparing it to a presidential, not a lot of surprises. When you're comparing it to a midterm, that's, I think, where people are, coming up with these, oh my God, this is shocking. Yeah. Well, it's not shocking if you compare it to a presidential.
Throughout the campaign, we've had a chance to visit with you and talk about specific legislative districts. I want to come back to one that we've talked about before, and that's Legislative District 18. It's one of the most closely watched, closely contested legislative districts in the battle at the state capitol. Ahwatukee, South Tempe, West Chandler, a lot of activity there of late. Takeaways from LD18.
Yeah, LD18's been an interesting one to watch because LD18, again, like everywhere else, the first week and a half was doing very well. Republicans outperforming even a midterm. That has been one of the areas that has progressively been getting worse and worse for Republicans. Republicans right now sit at a 0.5% ballot advantage for Republicans, and that nets to about 480 ballots. So that's actually a little bit less the presidential in the same time. So there's some, could be some potential danger zones. But again, I think a lot of people, myself included, expected it to be a lot worse. So by my super pessimistic initial projections, maybe 2 months ago before voting had even started, I think Republicans are doing better than the worst case scenario that I expected. I mean, obviously right now it's 2 Democrats and 1 Republican in the House. Most likely stays that way. I don't know. I think, I thought maybe a week ago there was a potential pickup opportunity for Republicans on the Senate side. I think that gets a little bit, murkier with the numbers. But again, I still think that district is what we had rated it, the rating change from before. Still think it's a toss-up because a lot of these districts, as again, many pundits are even talking about the House, the U.S. House nationwide, a lot of these districts on a razor's edge from a polling perspective and from a turnout perspective. And so it really could go either way depending on, I think, 2 big things to watch out for in that district. What percentage of Republicans vote for Democrats? Right. Okay. And then what do independents do? If Republicans, the vast majority of them hold their own and vote for Republicans, what you usually expect, then that's good obviously for Republicans. If Republicans even tie with independents or slightly lose versus being blown out of the water, that's also good, right? And District 18, District 28, and other those districts are also critical for one very key up ballot race, which is the U.S. Senate race, right? And I've mentioned before, Sinema's path to victory is through districts like this, but if she doesn't pick up a large percentage of Republicans, then it's going to be very difficult for her to win.
All right, last question. There are not any currently elected statewide Democrats. Is 2018 the year where a statewide Democrat wins?
I think this is the best chance the Democrats have had in a long time, obviously since Napolitano was a statewide elected Democrat, to have a statewide elected Democrat. Not just because of where the ballot advantage is, but combine the ballot advantage for Republicans, make that close to a presidential year, and then add in just the general tone and tenor in the state, and the fact that Democrats are, and I think anyone would admit this, are working and knocking doors probably more so than in recent memory, again, probably since the Napolitano years. So I think this is the best chance that they've had in a while to pick up a statewide seat. Now, I don't think it's what we call a quote-unquote up ballot statewide. I don't think it's the governor or attorney general. I still don't think it's most likely not Secretary of State, but they could have a chance
the further you go down the ballot, perhaps.
Yeah. They could, because the further down the ballot, as you know, the more it's just traditional Republican and Democrat. There's not a lot of name ID above what the traditional party name ID is. And so I think that's why, if there was a chance, it would be with some of those down ballot statewide races.
Well, George, we've appreciated having you throughout this election season to walk us through some of the polling and some of the early ballot returns. Good luck to you on Election Day.
Thanks. Thank you. And we'll be back January 1st to talk about 2020.
That's right. Thanks.